So, I just wanted to go through some slides to give a perspective on a history of educational technology. Having been a history teacher myself, I think it's always interesting to look back and see if it can kind of maybe give us some insights into what we might expect going forward. So, here's some images I'll be sharing with you. But first, I want to think about just the idea of what technology is. When I think of technology, I'll admit, I often say, oh, it's got to be something electronic, it's computers, that's all technology. But it's important to remember that the definition of technology is basically having to do with equipment developed from the application of scientific knowledge at a very broad level. So technology in 1800, there was still technology then. It's not what we think of a technology, but anytime you're coming up with some type of new equipment based on scientific knowledge, that's technology. So that's the broad term that we're thinking of technology. So here we go. This is something called the Horn Book, which was used in colonial times. This is educational technology, believe it or not. And basically, students were given printed pieces of paper that could be laid on top of this device. Also, as you see, it's got the alphabet there as a reference tool, but they didn't have, books were pretty rare, but there was, printing out maybe one page at a time for lessons. This was how they did it back then. Although, as you can imagine, it looks like that device could perhaps double as a disciplinary device. This is something called a ferrule, and basically it looks like something that I could have used, which is essentially a pointer. So if you have a map or you have something, a big image, a piece of art or something like that, you're trying to point out different things, that's all it was. But hey, it's technology. It made teachers' life a little more effective. Now, this is a classic piece of technology. I remember there used to be an old show called Little House on the Prairie, and all the students had these little slates. It's ironic that we think now of sometimes tablets are called slates. They're about the same size as an iPad here. And each student would practice their writing or math or whatever on these. So that was a pretty standard piece of school technology in the middle of the 1800s. So I'm going to play a little game with you here, and this is there are a series of quotes, and see if you can guess what educational technology is being described here. So I'll read it to you. This device appealed at once to the eye and to the ear, thus naturally forming the habit of attention, which is so difficult to form by the study of books. Whenever a pupil does not fully understand, it will have the opportunity of enlarging and making intelligible. So I'll give you a moment to think about that, what it could be. And on the count of three, 1, 2, 3, it was the chalkboard, 1855. There's a great book called Teachers and Machines by a guy named, I believe his name is Larry Cuban, who was at Stanford at the time. And he studied this history of technology in schools and discovered that there were actually professional development workshops for teachers around how to use the chalkboard in the classroom. When it was a new thing, teachers had to be trained on this. This was new to them. So imagine there could have been a course back in the day integrating the chalkboard into the classroom. We just take it for granted, whether it's now a dry erase board, but that was a new technology at one time. Okay, and this is what they look like. And perhaps some people argue this is the most significant educational technology for hundreds of years at the time. So this is a device called the Magic Lantern, which was commonly used before there was movies. People would go in their towns to see Magic Lantern presentations, which are almost like films. you'd have these little slides that you could project on a big wall. And these were used widely in schools. I read that the Department of Education of the city of Chicago had thousands and thousands of slides to go with magic lanterns in the late 1800s. Another interesting thing that looks similar to something you might see today, this makes me think almost of virtual reality viewers. It's called the stereoscope. When I grew up, there was something called the Viewmaster that you get this little viewer and you get little things from Disney or whatever you click, and every time you click, you get a different image inside the viewer. So this was a way to make certain objects appear 3D. This is in 1905, the stereoscope. Okay, another name that technology. So this thing is destined to revolutionize our educational system. In a few years, it will supplant largely, if not entirely, the use of textbooks. The education of the future will be conducted through the medium of blank, where it should be possible to obtain 100% efficiency. Isn't that what we all want in education? Maybe a little bit of hype, but this is interesting not only for what it is, but who said it. So I'll give you a moment to think about that. And I'll give you a clue. It was around the 1920s, if you know a little bit of history around technology. This was the motion picture, and this is a quote from Thomas Edison, who helped develop the motion picture, and he was convinced that using films in schools would mean that we would never need books again. Clearly that did not turn out to be the case, but it does point out that with these new technologies, there was often this hype that it would change everything as we know it, and often did not live up to that hype. Okay, and this is what the early film projectors look like. All right. Central and dominant aim of education by the blank is to bring the world to the classroom, to make universally available the services of the finest teachers, the inspiration of the greatest leaders, and unfolding world events. Think about that one for a minute, and the answer is the radio. And in fact, there were radio programs developed specifically for schools. And if you were in a school in New York City in the 20s and 30s, you turned on the radio at, say, 1 o'clock, and there would be a lesson piped in over the radio. So I don't remember ever using the radio as a teacher, but there you go. When that was a revolutionary technology, they thought this is gonna change everything. And this is what it would look like back then. This was the main form of communication, obviously before television. It was, for a brief period of time, this was a revolutionary device. So some other tools to look at, and some of these now are getting into tools that I use. I started teaching in the 80s, and I use the overhead projector quite a bit. Interestingly, this one is from the 40s, and the overhead projector was developed apparently during the late 30s and early 40s by the U.S. Army to help train Army troops, and to perhaps project a big map, and you're planning an assault or something like that. So the projector, you could write on things and annotate and things like that. And I was still using an overhead projector when I was teaching. And it's nice to get a big image. This is before you could have a computer hooked up to a projector. That was our way of projecting images. Mimeograph machine, I do remember using that as well. This is basically a way to make copies, but we did not have a copy machine the first year I taught. So the way this thing worked, you can see the paper, and underneath the paper there was kind of, if you imagine like a black ink-like second sheet of paper. So every time I would write by hand usually for my worksheets, and then you would run it through this machine, and that ink impression of what you wrote would allow you to make copies. The one thing I do remember that it had a very nice smell when you'd finished making, cranking out 30 or 40 copies on the mimeograph machine. So that was still used up into my career. This one I never used, but it's interesting. It's called the reading accelerator. If you look at the the piece of gray metal in the middle, I guess the idea was you could slide this metal down slowly as you're reading to reveal different parts of the text. Seems like maybe a lot of technology for something you might do with an index card, but there you go. It was a thing for a while. This is an early prototype of the Skinner teaching machine, and you will see in the resources for this week a little video. There's a guy named B.F. Skinner who developed these, and the basic idea was there would be questions that would appear, and in the little space, students would write in their answer, and then when they've written it, and they would slide the paper down, write in other answers, slide the paper down, write in other answers, and eventually then they could slide this little piece of metal over, and it would reveal all the right answers. So the breakthrough being that students used to have to, give little handouts to teachers, and it would take them a long time to grade. But this had all the answers, and they were just hidden. That was the magic. It was hidden. And students could get immediate feedback. Oh my God, how revolutionary is that? And these were widely used, and it also was connected to this approach, learning theory called behaviorist learning, the idea of give students immediate feedback and reward, and that's going to motivate them to learn more. So I just wanted to share those with you. Who knows what the technology of the future will be like? This idea here of having these almost hologram-like images to touch on is coming soon. And so just to summarize, technology is not just about computers. It's been around in schools for hundreds of years, often with a lot of hype. Some of them changed significantly teacher practice, some not so much. And who knows what the technology of the future will be. Thanks for watching.